The blood on Vincent Valiant's collar was still wet when he pushed through the glass door of Rosie's diner at 11:47 p.m. And the first thing he noticed wasn't the flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying hornet, or the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease. It was her, the waitress with dark skin that seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights, watching him with eyes that saw everything and judged nothing. Hey, beautiful people. Welcome back to another story that's going to shake you to your core. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. And I have to ask, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments because I love seeing how far these stories reach. And listen, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now because you don't want to miss what happens next in this story. I promised you that. Vincent's hand trembled slightly as he slid into the corner booth, the same hand that had held a gun against his oldest friend's head 3 hours ago, before everything went to hell, before the betrayal, before the bullets started flying in that warehouse on Morrison Street. And now here he was, a king with no kingdom, sitting in a diner that smelled like failure and old dreams while his empire burned somewhere across the city. The waitress approached with a coffee pot, her movements smooth and unhurried like she had all the time in the world. And Vincent studied her face for signs of recognition, because his face had been in the papers, on the news, whispered about in every dark corner of this god-forsaken city. But she just smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and said, "Coffee, honey," in a voice that reminded him of his grandmother before the cancer took her, before he became what he was. Black, he muttered, then caught himself because the word hung in the air strange and loaded. But she just nodded and poured without flinching, and he noticed her name tag said Tiana and wondered what kind of life she lived, what kind of dreams kept her working the graveyard shift at a place like this. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably Sal, probably his brother, probably everyone who wanted him dead now that Carmine had turned the entire organization against him with lies and manipulated ledgers and a video that didn't show the whole truth, never showed how Carmine had been skimming for months, how he'd been planning this coup like a silent cancer growing in the heart of the family. Vincent's ribs ached where the bullet had grazed him, and he pressed his arm against his side, feeling the makeshift bandage he'd tied in the car growing damp. But he couldn't go to a hospital, couldn't go anywhere his face was known, so he'd driven until the city lights blurred into suburb darkness and found this place, this forgotten little diner, where hopefully no one would look twice at a man trying to disappear. Tiana moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, wiping down surfaces that probably hadn't been truly clean in a decade. And something about her calm presence made Vincent's racing heart slow just a fraction, made the roaring in his ears quiet enough that he could hear the country song playing low on the jukebox. Something about roads not taken and chances lost. He raised the coffee cup to his lips and caught his reflection in the window. He looked older than his 42 years, looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix, and he thought about his daughter Sophia, who hadn't spoken to him in 3 years, who'd begged him to leave the life, to choose her over the family business, and he'd chosen wrong, like he always did. The bell above the door chimed, and 3 men walked in, and Vincent knew before they even moved that something was wrong. Knew it in the way his spine stiffened, and his hand automatically went to his waist where his gun should have been, except he ditched it in the storm drain 2 miles back, because he couldn't be caught with it. Couldn't add that to the list of charges Carmine was probably already manufacturing. Have you ever just known something bad was about to happen? Drop a comment if you've ever felt that gut instinct that saves your life. The 3 men spread out too deliberately, too practiced, and the one in front pulled a shotgun from under his coat, while the other 2 drew pistols, and the man with the shotgun yelled, "Everybody down! This is a robbery! Nobody moves, and nobody dies. And the two other customers, an old man reading a newspaper and a truck driver with kind eyes, hit the floor immediately, but Vincent stayed frozen in his booth, calculating angles and distances and odds, all of which were terrible. Then he looked at Tiana, expecting to see fear or panic or the wide-eyed terror that normal people showed when violence walked through the door. But instead she was standing behind the counter, absolutely still, her eyes moving between the robbers with an expression Vincent recognized, because he'd worn it himself 1,000 times. She was reading the room, counting threats, looking for plays. The robber with the shotgun moved toward the register and barked, "You, waitress! Open it now!" But Tiana didn't rush, didn't fumble, just moved with that same unhurried grace. And something in her glance, just a flicker, just a fraction of a second, cut toward Vincent, and he understood somehow that she'd clocked him too, had recognized that he wasn't like the others cowering on the floor, that he was dangerous in a different way. Vincent's pulse hammered against his throat because he was unarmed and wounded and wanted by both the law and the lawless. And the last thing he needed was to be here when the cops showed up. But something about the way Tiana stood there, fearless and focused, made him wait, made him watch, made him wonder what this woman with the gentle voice and iron spine was going to do next. The second robber was sweeping his pistol across the diner, his hand shaking badly enough that Vincent knew he was either high or terrified or both. The dangerous kind of criminal, the unpredictable kind. And Vincent caught Tiana's eyes again, and this time she did something that stopped his heart. She smiled at him, just a tiny lift at the corner of her mouth, like she had a secret, like she had a plan, like she was about to do something that would change everything. What was this waitress about to do that would save a mafia boss and turn his entire world upside down? Vincent Valiant had learned to read people at age 12 when his father took him to his first sit-down and taught him that the eyes always told the truth, even when the mouth was lying. And watching Tiana now, he saw no fear in those dark eyes, only calculation and something else he couldn't name, something that looked almost like purpose. And it made him think of his daughter Sophia, who had that same quiet strength before he'd ruined everything between them with his choices and his blood-soaked legacy. The robber with the shotgun slammed his hand on the counter, and Tiana jerked a register open with steady fingers. And Vincent noticed the way she palmed something small while she pulled out the bills, noticed how she angled her body just slightly to keep the security camera's view clear, and he realized this woman wasn't just brave. She was smart, street smart, in a way that came from surviving things that should have broken her. "Faster!" the shotgun man screamed, and his voice cracked with chemical edge that confirmed Vincent's suspicion about drugs, probably meth from the way his jaw kept grinding and his pupils had swallowed his irises. And Vincent knew from 30 years in the life that tweakers were the most dangerous kind of desperate, because pain and consequence didn't register the same way in their rewired brains. Tiana's hands moved smoothly, counting out bills into a plastic bag the robber shoved at her, and she said in that same calm, honey voice, "It's okay. Just take what you need. Nobody has to get hurt here." And something about her tone actually made the shotgun man's shoulders drop 1/2 inch from his ears, made his breathing slow just a fraction. And Vincent watched this act of verbal magic with the fascination of a man who'd only ever controlled people through fear. The third robber, younger than the others with acne scars and a Dallas Cowboys jacket, moved toward the old man on the floor, and Vincent's muscles tensed, because this was often when robberies went wrong, when the young ones tried to prove something, tried to show dominance by hurting someone weak. And Vincent had seen it play out badly too many times in his own organization, when young soldiers got too eager to make their bones. Vincent's deepest fear, the one that woke him at 3 a.m. soaked in sweat, wasn't dying, or prison, or even the betrayal that had cost him everything tonight. It was dying alone and unmourned, dying as the monster his daughter believed him to be. Never having proven that somewhere under the violence and the blood, there was still the boy who'd wanted to be a teacher, who'd loved poetry and old movies before his father beat those soft dreams out of him and replaced them with the family business. If you've ever felt stuck in a life you didn't choose, but can't escape, leave a comment, because this story is about to show you something powerful about second chances. Tiana caught Vincent's eye again, and this time she held his gaze for 2 full seconds. And in that look, he saw a question and an answer all at once. Saw her asking him silently if he was going to be a problem or an ally. And something about being seen so clearly by a stranger made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with his cracked ribs. The truth was, Vincent Valiant had been invisible his whole life, despite being famous, had been a symbol and a ghost story, and a name whispered in fear, but no one had really seen him. Not his wife, who divorced him after he missed his son's funeral because of a deal he couldn't walk away from. Not his lieutenants, who smiled in his face while calculating how to replace him. Not even his own reflection in the mirror most mornings when he shaved around the scars and tried not to recognize the stranger staring back. Tiana, though, this waitress in a cheap diner, working a shift that paid maybe $7 an hour plus tips. She saw something in him, and he desperately wanted to know what it was. Wanted to know if maybe she saw something worth saving under all the damage and the darkness. The old man on the floor started whimpering, and the young robber in the cowboy's jacket kicked him lightly in the ribs and said, "Shut up, old-timer." And Vincent watched Tiana's jaw tighten just slightly, watched her fingers grip the counter edge with enough force to blanch her knuckles, and he realized she wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting everyone in this diner, had somehow taken responsibility for all these lives, including his. "That's everything in the register," Tiana said, her voice still steady, but with a new edge of steel underneath the honey. $462. You got what you came for, so take it and go. Leave these people alone. The shotgun man grabbed the bag, and Vincent saw his finger tighten on the trigger. Saw the calculation happening in his meth-addled brain about whether leaving witnesses was smart. And Vincent knew with absolute certainty that this man was about to start shooting, was about to kill everyone in his diner, starting with Tiana, because she'd looked him in the eye, and that felt like disrespect to someone whose masculinity was as fragile as spun glass. What Vincent wanted more than anything in that moment, more than his empire back, more than revenge on Carmine, more than even reconciliation with Sophia, was to save this woman who'd shown him more humanity in 5 minutes than he'd experienced in 5 years. And the realization hit him like a physical blow, that maybe his whole life had been leading to this moment. This choice, this chance to be something other than the monster everyone believed him to be. Tiana had a daughter too. Vincent somehow knew this from the small photo, barely visible tucked in her apron pocket. From the way she'd glanced at the clock when she'd poured his coffee like she was counting hours until she could get home to someone who mattered. And he wondered if her daughter looked at her with the same disappointment Sophia showed him, or if Tiana had managed to be the kind of parent he'd failed to become. The young robber pulled a wallet from the old man's pocket, and Tiana said, "Hey!" Just that one word, but loaded with such authority that all 3 robbers actually looked at her. And Vincent thought, this is it. This is where it turns. This is where everything changes. And he shifted his weight, preparing to move, even though he had no weapon and no plan, except the desperate need to make sure this brave, foolish woman didn't die for standing up to predators who wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet in her beautiful face. That wallet belongs to a man who probably worked 40 years for what little he has, Tiana said, and her voice cut through the diner like a blade wrapped in velvet. And the young robber actually hesitated, actually looked uncertain. And Vincent saw the exact moment when the shotgun man's drug paranoid brain decided that this waitress was a threat that needed to be eliminated, saw his shoulders shift and his grip adjust, and his fingers start to squeeze. And Vincent opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Tiana was already moving, was already stepping out from behind the counter with her hands visible and empty, walking straight toward the shotgun like she was approaching a skittish animal instead of a weapon that could cut her in half. "What the hell are you doing?" the shotgun man screamed, and Vincent's heart hammered against his ribs hard enough to make his wound pulse hot and wet. But Tiana just kept walking with that same unhurried grace and said, "I'm doing what you should have done 10 minutes ago. I'm thinking clearly, because right now you've got robbery, which is maybe 5 years, with good behavior, but you pull that trigger and it's murder 1, it's life or the needle, depending on the state's mood. And I don't think you want that. I think you're smarter than that." The way she said it, with such absolute certainty and respect, like she genuinely believed in his intelligence, made the shotgun waver, and Vincent realized he was watching a master class in de-escalation. Was watching this woman do with words what he'd only ever managed with violence and fear. And something shifted in his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope, or maybe redemption, or maybe just the first stirrings of an emotion he thought had died the day he put his first man in the ground. Drop a comment right now if you've ever seen someone be so brave. It changed how you saw the whole world, because that's what's happening to Vincent in this moment. The shotgun man's hands were shaking harder now, and Vincent could see sweat running down his temples, and knew they were in the most dangerous 60 seconds of this whole encounter, because cornered, desperate people did desperate things. And he slowly slid out of the booth, his body screaming protest from the bullet graze and the cracked ribs and the 1,000 other injuries accumulated over 3 decades of war. But he stayed low and quiet, because Tiana had this, somehow this miracle woman had this, and he needed to trust her, even though trust was a concept he'd abandoned around the same time he'd made his first kill. "Look at me," Tiana said, and her voice dropped lower, more intimate, like she was talking to a friend instead of a robber. "Look at my eyes and tell me you want to hurt people. Tell me that's who you are, because I don't believe it. I think you're scared, and you needed money, and you made a bad choice. But it doesn't have to be the choice that ruins your whole life." The young robber in the cowboy's jacket whispered, "Kenny, man, maybe we should just go." And Vincent caught the name, filed it away in the part of his brain that never stopped cataloging threats and leverage. But then he looked at Tiana's face and felt ashamed, because she wasn't thinking about leverage or revenge. She was trying to save everyone, including the men who'd come to rob her. Kenny, the shotgun man's face crumpled, and for a second Vincent thought he was going to cry. Thought this whole thing was going to end without blood. But then the third robber, the one who'd been silent until now, the one with dead eyes and a teardrop tattoo that meant he'd already killed, said, "She's playing you, Kenny. She's stalling for cops." And he raised his pistol and pointed it directly at Diana's head from 6 feet away. And Vincent's body moved before his brain caught up. Years of combat instinct overriding everything else. And he grabbed the coffee pot from the nearest table and hurled it at the shooter's face. The pot exploded against the man's temple in a spray of hot coffee and shattered glass. And he went down screaming. And Vincent was already moving toward the young one in the cowboy's jacket, catching his gun arm before he could raise it, and twisting hard enough to feel tendons pop, and the pistol clatter to the floor. And somewhere in his peripheral vision, he saw Tiana lunge forward and grabbed the shotgun barrel, pushing it toward the ceiling just as Kenny pulled the trigger, and the blast was deafening in the enclosed space, raining acoustic tiles and insulation down on them like toxic snow. Vincent's ears rang so loud the world went silent except for a high whine, and he drove his elbow into Cowboy's jacket's nose, felt cartilage crunch, then spun to see Tiana still gripping the shotgun, still fighting Kenny for control, and something primal and terrifying surged through Vincent, because this woman, this stranger, was in danger, and every cell in his body screamed to protect her, and he realized with crystal clarity that he would die for her right now, would take a bullet for this waitress he'd met 20 minutes ago, and the intensity of that feeling was more frightening than any gun ever pointed at his head. He crossed the distance in 2 strides and hit Kenny with a straight right that had 30 years of violence behind it, and the man dropped like a puppet with cut strings. And suddenly it was over. 3 robbers down, and the silence after the shotgun blast felt thick and holy. And Vincent turned to Tiana, expecting shock or fear or trauma, but she was already moving to the old man on the floor, helping him sit up, checking him for injuries. And when she looked up at Vincent, their eyes locked, and something passed between them that had no name, something that felt like recognition and gratitude, and the beginning of something neither of them had words for. "You know how to handle yourself," she said, and it wasn't a question. And Vincent heard the subtext, heard her asking, "Who are you, really?" And he wanted to lie, wanted to protect her from the truth of what he was. But those dark eyes demanded honesty in a way that made deception feel impossible. "I've had practice," he said, and his voice came out rougher than intended. And Tiana nodded slowly and said, "I figured you got the look. My brother had it too, before he got out." And Vincent's eyebrows rose because there was a story there, a depth to this woman that went way beyond waitressing at a diner. And he wanted suddenly, desperately to know everything about her, where she came from, what she'd survived, what made her so fearless in the face of death. The truck driver wasn't already on his phone with 911, and Vincent knew he had maybe 3 minutes before cops arrived, and his face got run through the system, and everything went to hell. But he couldn't move, couldn't stop staring at Tiana as she calmly collected the weapons and kicked them under the counter as she checked on each person with genuine concern. And when she came to him, she looked at his side where blood was starting to show through his shirt and said, "You're hurt," with such tenderness it nearly broke something in him. "I'm fine," Vincent lied. But Tiana was already lifting his jacket, her fingers quick and professional, and when she saw the blood-soaked makeshift bandage, she inhaled sharply and said, "This is a bullet wound. You need a hospital." But Vincent caught her wrist, gentle but firm, and said, "No hospitals, no police reports, please." And the please surprised them both because Vincent Valiant didn't beg, hadn't said that word with genuine need in more years than he could count. But something about her touch, about the concern in her eyes, made him vulnerable in a way that terrified him. Tiana studied his face for a long moment, and he could see her putting pieces together, could see the intelligence working behind those eyes. And she said quietly, "You're in trouble, real trouble, not just this robbery trouble." And it wasn't a question, and Vincent nodded, because lying to her felt like a sin. And she bit her lip, thinking, and said, "The cops will be here in 2 minutes. You need to go. Out the back through the kitchen. There's an alley that runs behind the strip mall." And Vincent's chest tightened, because she was helping him escape, was choosing to protect him even though she didn't know what he'd done or who he was running from. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. And Tiana's expression softened, and she said, "Because you helped me first. Because you could have run when those men came in, but you stayed. And because I've seen enough of the world to know the difference between bad men and good men, who've had to do bad things. And her words hit him like a physical blow, because no one, not in his entire life, had given him that grace, had seen past the violence to the choices and the circumstances and the desperate survival underneath. The sound of sirens cut through the night, still distant but getting closer, and Vincent knew he should move, should run, should disappear like he'd done 100 times before. But his feet stayed planted because leaving Tiana felt impossible. Felt like abandoning something precious he didn't even know he'd been searching for. And when she pushed gently against his chest and said, "Go now," he caught her hand and said, "What's your last name?" And she looked confused, but answered, "Bogart, Tiana Bogart," and he committed it to memory like a prayer. "I'm Vincent," he said, and she smiled despite everything, despite the chaos and the unconscious robbers and the approaching sirens, and said, "I know. I saw your credit card when you were reaching for your coffee. Vincent Valiant. And yeah, I know who you are. I've seen the news." And Vincent's blood went cold, because if she knew, if she'd recognized him, then she knew about the charges Carmine had manufactured, knew about the warrant, knew he was supposedly a monster who'd betrayed his own family, and he waited for her expression to change, for the warmth to leave her eyes. But instead she squeezed his hand and said, "The news lies. I learned that when they lied about my brother. So I'm choosing to believe what I saw tonight, instead of what they say you are." Vincent wanted to kiss her, wanted to pull this incredible woman into his arms and taste that brave mouth, wanted to tell her everything about the betrayal and the frame-up and his desperate need to clear his name, and maybe find a way to be the man she seemed to think he could be. But the sirens were close now, maybe 30 seconds out, and Tiana physically turned him toward the kitchen and said, "Go. And Vincent, stay alive, okay? Something tells me you've got a lot of good left to do." And then she shoved him, and he stumbled toward the kitchen door, looking back at her one more time, memorizing her face, the curve of her cheek, the determination in her eyes, before he pushed through into the kitchen and out the back door into the alley where his car waited. If you're feeling the chemistry between these two, drop a comment and tell me if you think Vincent should come back for Tiana. Because trust me, this story is about to get even more intense. Vincent's hands shook as he started the car, and he told himself it was adrenaline from the fight, from the close call with the cops. But he knew the truth was Tiana Bogart had shaken something loose in him, had cracked the armor he'd built over decades, and now he sat in a dark alley bleeding and wanted by everyone dangerous in the city, thinking not about survival, but about a waitress who'd saved his life with nothing but courage and words. He drove aimlessly for 20 minutes, checking mirrors for tails, keeping to side streets, and his mind wouldn't stop replaying the way Tiana had walked toward that shotgun, the absolute fearlessness of it. And he'd known soldiers who'd trained for years who couldn't have done what she did, and he wondered what her story was. What had forged that kind of steel in her spine? His phone buzzed again, and this time he looked, saw 17 missed calls from his brother Anthony, and he finally answered. And Anthony's voice came through frantic, "Vinny! Jesus Christ! Where are you? Carmine's got everyone looking. He's saying you stole from the family. He's got pictures, documents. He's turning everyone against you." And Vincent closed his eyes because this was worse than he'd thought. Carmine hadn't just moved against him. He'd been planning this for months, building a false case that would justify his execution. "The documents are fake, Tony. Carmine's been skimming, and he's flipping it on me. You have to believe me," Vincent said. And there was a pause that lasted too long, and Anthony said, "I want to believe you. Vinny, I do. But the evidence, man, it looks bad. And the council's already voted. They want you brought in." And the words brought in meant killed, meant disappeared, meant his body would turn up in the pine barrens, or maybe not turn up at all. And Vincent realized his own brother wasn't sure, wasn't completely convinced of his innocence, and the betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. "Did you vote to kill me, Tony?" Vincent asked, and his voice came out flat and dead. And Anthony said, "I abstained. I couldn't. You're my brother. But Vinny, if you don't come in and face this, they're going to assume guilt. And they're going to come hard. And they won't stop until you're dead." And Vincent hung up because there was nothing left to say, no words that would bridge the gap between them. And he sat in his car watching the dashboard clock tick over to 12:47 a.m. and thought about how 12 hours ago he'd had an empire, and now he had nothing except a bullet wound and the memory of a waitress who'd believed in him. His wound throbbed, and when he touched the bandage, his fingers came away bright with blood, and he knew he needed medical attention, needed supplies at minimum, and the only person he could trust was his old friend Jimmy Whitaker, who'd been the family doctor before he lost his license for prescribing pills to soldiers who needed them to cope with what they did in the dark. And Vincent pulled up to Jimmy's house in Queens 40 minutes later, and Jimmy took one look at him and said, "You look like death. Get inside," and didn't ask questions until Vincent was on the kitchen table being stitched up with veterinary supplies Jimmy kept for occasions exactly like this. "You're the most wanted man in New York tonight," Jimmy said while he worked, and Vincent grunted and said, "Carmine's play." And Jimmy nodded and said, "Beautiful setup. I'll give him that. He's got everyone convinced you've been stealing for years. Got fake ledgers, offshore accounts in your name. Even got a witness who says they saw you meeting with the feds." And Vincent's head snapped up, because that was new. That was worse than he'd imagined. Being labeled a thief was bad, but being called a rat was a death sentence that would follow him forever. "Who's the witness?" Vincent asked. And Jimmy's face went grim and said, "Your driver, Paulie." And Vincent felt sick because Paulie had been with him for 8 years, had driven his daughter to school, had been at his wife's funeral, and the idea that Paulie would betray him, would lie about him being an informant, meant Carmine had either paid him a fortune or threatened something Paulie loved more than loyalty. "Is any of this getting through to you, Vinny?" Jimmy asked, tying off the last stitch. "You can't fight this. You can't win. You need to run. Take the money you've got hidden and disappear. Start over somewhere. They'll never find you." And it was good advice. Was the smart play. Was what Vincent would have told anyone else in his situation. But all he could think about was Tiana standing in the diner with police probably questioning her right now, asking her about the man who'd fought the robbers. And he wondered if she'd tell them about him, or if she'd protect his secret, the way she'd protected everyone else tonight. Vincent's phone lit up with a text from a number he didn't recognize, and when he opened it, his blood froze, because it was a photo of Tiana leaving the diner with 2 police officers. And the message said, "Pretty waitress. Heard she helped you tonight. Would be a shame if something happened to her. Come face justice, or she pays for your cowardice." And it was from Carmine. Had to be. Because only Carmine would move this fast. Would already have people watching the diner. Would be willing to threaten an innocent woman to draw Vincent out. "What is it?" Jimmy asked, and Vincent showed him the phone, and Jimmy whistled low and said, "He's baiting you. You know that, right? He wants you emotional and stupid. Wants you to come in trying to protect her so he can put you down." And Vincent knew it was true, knew it was a trap, but the image of Tiana in danger because of him, because she'd shown him kindness, made his hands clench into fists and his jaw lock with rage that tasted like copper and smoke. "I have to warn her," Vincent said, and Jimmy grabbed his shoulder and said, You go near her and you paint a target on her back. The only way to protect her is to stay away, to let this blow over. But Vincent shook his head, because staying away meant trusting Carmine to leave her alone. And Carmine hadn't left anyone alone in his entire vicious life. And Vincent thought about his daughter Sophia, who'd gotten death threats because of him, who'd had to move 3 times and change her name, because being a valiant made her a target. And he couldn't let that happen to Tiana, couldn't let his poison touch her life. He pulled up everything he could find on Tiana Bogart on his phone, while Jimmy cleaned up the medical supplies. And what he found made his chest ache, because she had a daughter named Kennedy, age 7, and Tiana was working 3 jobs to support her. And her brother Marquez had been killed by police 5 years ago in a shooting that the family said was unjustified, but the court said was clean. And Vincent understood suddenly why she'd looked at him with such knowing eyes. Why she'd said the news lies. Because she'd lived through her own version of being on the wrong side of public opinion, of watching someone she loved be destroyed by a system that didn't care about truth. The clock on Jimmy's wall read 2:15 a.m., and Vincent knew Tiana would be home by now, knew she'd be checking on her sleeping daughter, and maybe thinking about the crazy night she'd survived. And he wanted to call her, wanted to hear her voice and warned her about Carmine, but he had no way to reach her, except through the diner, and that line was probably tapped by now, probably being monitored by Carmine's people or the feds or both. And the frustration of wanting to protect someone he couldn't touch made him want to put his fist through Jimmy's wall. Vincent was still at Jimmy's house trying to formulate a plan when his burner phone rang at 3:22 a.m. with a number he didn't recognize, and every instinct screamed trap. But he answered anyway, and Tiana's voice came through breathless and scared, and he sat up so fast his stitches pulled. "Vincent, I need to see you. I know something about why this is happening to you, but I can't talk on the phone, please. Can you meet me?" And Vincent's mind raced through possibilities, wondering if Carmine had gotten to her, if this was the trap. But something in her voice, the genuine fear underneath the words, made him say, "Where?" And she gave him an address to a 24-hour laundromat in Brooklyn. Neutral ground, public enough to be safe, but empty enough at this hour to talk. And Vincent told Jimmy he was leaving, and Jimmy said, "You're walking into a setup." But Vincent was already out the door because if there was even a chance Tiana was really in trouble, he had to go. The laundromat was exactly as depressing as Vincent expected, fluorescent lights buzzing over rows of washing machines, and Tiana sat in a plastic chair near the back. And when she saw him, her whole body relaxed with relief, and she stood, and without thinking, Vincent crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest. And they stood like that for a long moment, 2 people who'd known each other for less than 4 hours, holding onto each other like lifelines. And when they finally pulled apart, Vincent saw tears on her cheeks and wanted to destroy whoever had put them there. "Tell me what's wrong," he said, and Tiana pulled out her phone with shaking hands and showed him a text message that made his blood turn to ice. It was a photo of her daughter Kennedy sleeping in her bed, taken from inside the bedroom, taken tonight. And the message said, "Beautiful family. Hope nothing happens to them. Your friend Vincent brings danger wherever he goes." And Vincent felt rage so pure and hot, it nearly blinded him, because Carmine had sent someone into this woman's home, had threatened a 7-year-old child, and there were lines you didn't cross even in their world. And this was so far over those lines, it might as well be in another country. "I got my daughter out," Tiana said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Called my aunt. She picked up Kennedy an hour ago. Drove her upstate to my cousin's place where she'll be safe. But Vincent, Whoever sent this knows who you are, knows you were at the diner, and they know about me now, and I need to understand what I'm in the middle of because I've got a daughter to protect, and I can't do that if I don't know what I'm fighting. And Vincent had never respected anyone more than he respected this woman in this moment. Scared but strategic, threatened but still standing. And he sat down and told her everything about Carmine's betrayal, about the fake evidence, about being framed as a thief and a rat. And Tiana listened with those dark, intelligent eyes, taking in every word. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that stopped his heart. Carmine Lucio, that's the man who framed you. And Vincent nodded, and Tiana's expression went hard and cold. And she said, 5 years ago, my brother Jerome was killed by police during a raid on a warehouse in Red Hook. They said he was dealing drugs, said he pulled a gun, but my brother didn't touch drugs, didn't own a gun, and we could never figure out why he was even in that warehouse. And Vincent's mind started racing because 5 years ago he'd been running operations in Red Hook. And Tiana continued, I've spent 5 years looking into it, talking to people, following threads, and I found out that warehouse was owned by a shell company, and that shell company was owned by someone in your organization. And 3 months ago, I finally got a name. And she pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to Vincent. And when he opened it and saw the name written there in Tiana's careful handwriting, his entire world tilted because the name was Carmine Lucio. Carmine owned that warehouse, Vincent said slowly, pieces clicking together in his mind. And 5 years ago, there were rumors about someone in the family running a side operation, selling to independents, cutting out the main organization, but we could never prove who. And Tiana nodded and said, the police report said they got a tip about a major drug operation, but when they raided it, my brother was the only one there, like he'd been set up, like someone called him there and then called the cops. And Vincent felt sick, because he understood exactly what had happened. Carmine had been running drugs through that warehouse, had probably needed to shut it down fast when he got wind of an investigation, and he'd used Tiana's brother as a patsy, had set up an innocent man to take the fall and get killed in the process. If this revelation is hitting you as hard as it's hitting Vincent right now, let me know in the comments, because this changes everything about the story. Why were you working at that diner? Vincent asked, and Tiana's expression shifted to something that looked like determination mixed with pain, and she said, because 3 weeks ago I tracked down a man who used to work for your organization, and he told me that Carmine Lucio eats at Rosie's diner every Tuesday and Thursday, late night after his other meetings. And I got a job there hoping to see him, to maybe find a way to talk to him or follow him or something. I didn't have a real plan. I just needed to be close to the man who killed my brother. And Vincent's chest constricted because this woman, this brave, incredible woman, had been conducting her own investigation, her own mission for justice, and fate had put him in that diner on a night Carmine didn't show, had created this collision between their two worlds. Tonight wasn't his night, Vincent said quietly, and Tiana nodded. I know. I've been working there 3 weeks, and he's never come in, and I was starting to think my information was bad. But then you walked in looking like you were running from the devil, and then those robbers came, and I don't know. Maybe it was meant to happen this way. And she looked at him with such raw honesty that Vincent couldn't stop himself. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. And she kissed him back with a desperation that matched his own. And it wasn't soft or gentle. It was the kiss of two people who'd been through hell and found each other on the other side. And when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and Tiana said, I don't even know you. But her hands were fisted in his shirt, like she might never let go. You know me better than people I've worked with for 20 years, Vincent said. And it was true. This woman had seen him at his most vulnerable, had protected him when she had no reason to, and now he understood they were connected not just by attraction, but by Carmine's cruelty, by the lives he'd destroyed in his climb to power. And Vincent said, I'm going to help you get justice for your brother, and I'm going to clear my name, and I'm going to make sure you and Kennedy are safe. I promise you this, Tiana. And she said, How? You're one man against an entire organization. And Vincent smiled without humor and said, I've got something Carmine doesn't have. I've got the truth, and I've got you, and I've got nothing left to lose, which makes me the most dangerous kind of enemy. Tiana's phone buzzed, and when she looked at it, her face went pale, and she showed Vincent a news alert, and his stomach dropped because it was his daughter Sophia's photo on the screen, and the headline read, Mafia princess missing, feared kidnapped, in connection with father's crimes. And Vincent's hands started shaking because Sophia had been unreachable by choice, had cut him off by choice. But if Carmine had taken her, if he was using her as leverage, then this wasn't just about Vincent anymore. This was about everyone he'd ever loved being in danger. And Tiana grabbed his hand and said, We'll find her. Vincent, we'll get her back. And he looked at this woman who had every reason to hate him, whose brother had died because of his world, and she was offering to help him save his daughter. And he realized he was falling in love with her, was maybe already in love with her, and the timing was impossible and the circumstances were insane, but his heart didn't care about logic. I need to make a call, Vincent said, and he dialed Anthony's number, and when his brother answered, Vincent said, Did you know about Sophia? And Anthony's voice was tight with stress. Just heard an hour ago, Vinny. Carmine's saying he'll release her if you turn yourself in. He's got the whole council convinced this is the only way. And Vincent closed his eyes and said, Tony, I need you to trust me. Carmine killed an innocent man 5 years ago, set him up to cover his own drug operation. And now he's framing me the same way. And I can prove it, but I need time. And there was a long pause. And Anthony said, What proof? And Vincent looked at Tiana and said, I've got a witness, I've got documentation, and I've got 48 hours to bring it all together. Can you give me that? Can you hold the council off for 2 days? And Anthony sighed and said, I'll try, Vinny. But if Sophia gets hurt because you didn't come in, I'll never forgive you. And the line went dead. And Vincent sat in a laundromat at 4 a.m. with a woman he'd just met, planning to take down a man who'd already proven he'd kill anyone who got in his way. And the smart move would be to run, to grab Tiana and disappear and let the chips fall where they may. But Vincent Valiant was done running, was done letting Carmine destroy lives. And he looked at Tiana and said, Are you sure you want to be part of this? Because it's going to get worse before it gets better. And she squeezed his hand and said, That man killed my brother, and now he's threatening my daughter and yours. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Vincent and Tiana spent the next 18 hours building their case against Carmine, tracking down the warehouse records, finding the shell company documents, and locating 2 witnesses who'd worked for Carmine during the Red Hook operation. But at 10 p.m. the following night, everything fell apart when Vincent's phone rang with Sophia's voice, screaming, Daddy, please help me, they're hurting me. And then Carmine came on the line and said, You've got 1 hour, Vinny. Meet me at the old fish processing plant on Pier 29. Come alone and unarmed, or I start sending your daughter back to you in pieces. And then the line went dead, and Vincent stood frozen in the motel room they'd been working from, his worst nightmare playing out in real time. And Tiana grabbed his arm and said, It's a trap. You know it's a trap. But Vincent was already checking his gun. Because trap or not, that was his daughter screaming, and he'd failed her enough in life that he couldn't fail her in death. I have to go, Vincent said. And Tiana's eyes filled with tears, and she said, Then I'm coming with you. But Vincent shook his head and said, No, you've got Kennedy to think about. You've got a life to get back to, and I can't have your death on my conscience too. And Tiana slapped him, hard enough to snap his head sideways, and said, Don't you dare try to protect me by pushing me away. Don't you dare decide what I can handle. I'm a grown woman who survived things that would have broken you. And if you walk out that door without me, I'll follow you anyway, so you might as well save us both the time. And Vincent had never loved anyone more than he loved her in that moment. Fierce and fearless and refusing to let him face darkness alone. They took Vincent's car and drove to Pier 29 in silence, both of them knowing the odds were terrible. Both of them knowing this might be the last hour they spent alive. And when Vincent parked 3 blocks away from the processing plant, he turned to Tiana and said, If this goes bad, if I don't make it, there's a safety deposit box at First National, keys in my wallet. Everything you need to finish what we started is in there. Promise me you'll see it through. And Tiana grabbed his face and kissed him hard and said, We're both making it out. You hear me? Because I didn't wait 32 years to find someone worth loving, just to lose him after one day. And the word loving hung in the air between them, bright and terrifying and perfect. And Vincent said, I love you too. I know it's crazy, but I do. And Tiana smiled with tears running down her face and said, Then let's go save your daughter, so we can have a chance at a real life together. The processing plant was exactly the kind of place where people disappeared forever. Rusted metal and broken windows and the smell of rot coming off the water. And Vincent moved through the darkness with Tiana behind him. And he could see lights on in the main building, could see shadows moving inside, and he counted at least 6 men, which meant Carmine had brought an army, had made sure Vincent couldn't fight his way out, even if he wanted to. They entered through a side door that Vincent remembered from 20 years ago, when this place had still been operational and he'd used it for meetings. And they crept through the old machinery room until they could see into the main floor. And what Vincent saw made his heart stop, because Sophia was there, tied to a chair, her face bruised and bloody, and Carmine stood next to her with a gun in his hand. And arranged around the room were 8 men, not 6, all armed, all watching the main entrance. And Vincent knew with certainty that he'd walk out there and they'd kill him immediately, and Sophia would probably die anyway because leaving witnesses wasn't Carmine's style. We need a different plan, Tiana whispered, and Vincent nodded, because the direct approach was suicide, and he scanned the room looking for options. And he saw the old conveyor system that ran along the ceiling, saw the catwalk that led to the office, saw the industrial freezer that probably still worked. And an idea started forming, desperate and dangerous, but better than nothing. And he was about to explain it to Tiana when his phone buzzed with a text from Anthony that said, Vinny, I'm sorry. I told them I'd help, but Carmine got to me, threatened my kids. I had to tell him about the evidence you were gathering. I'm so sorry, brother. And Vincent's chest constricted because his own brother had betrayed him, had given Carmine the one piece of information that made this whole night make sense. Carmine knew about the witnesses, knew about the documents, which meant he'd probably already silenced the witnesses and destroyed any evidence. And the case Vincent and Tiana had built was worthless now, was ashes, and they had nothing. If you've ever felt like everything you worked for just crumbled in your hands. Drop a comment, because Vincent's about to face the hardest choice of his life. What is it? Tiana asked, and Vincent showed her the text, and he watched her face fall as she understood what it meant. And she said, We can find other evidence. other witnesses. We just need time." But Vincent shook his head. Because time was the one thing they didn't have. Carmine's voice echoed through the building. 5 minutes, Vinny. Then I start with her fingers." And Sophia whimpered, and Vincent felt something break inside him, because his little girl, his baby, who used to sit on his lap and make him read her the same story 5 times, was suffering because of him, because of who he was, because he'd chosen this life instead of being the father she deserved. "I have to turn myself in," Vincent said. And Tiana grabbed his arm hard enough to hurt and said, "No, that's what he wants. You walk out there and you both die." But Vincent pulled away and said, "Maybe. But at least I died trying to save her. At least she knows I chose her this time." And Tiana's face twisted with anguish, and she said, "And what about me? What about us? What about the future you just said you wanted?" And Vincent cupped her face and said, "You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Even if it was only for a day, you showed me I could be something other than a monster. And I love you for that. But she's my daughter, and I have to try." And he kissed her one last time, tasting salt from her tears. And then he stood and walked toward the main floor before Tiana could stop him. "I'm here, Carmine," Vincent called out, stepping into the light with his hands up. And every gun in the room swung toward him, and Carmine smiled like a shark and said, "No weapon? Good. You're learning obedience in your old age." And Vincent walked slowly toward Sophia, watching her eyes widen with fear and love and regret. And he said, "Let her go. You've got me. That was the deal." But Carmine laughed and said, "The deal was, you come alone, but my men just found your waitress girlfriend in the machinery room, and they're bringing her out now." And Vincent's heart plummeted as 2 of Carmine's soldiers dragged Tiana into the room, and she fought like a wildcat. But there were 2 of them, and they threw her down next to Vincent. And Carmine said, "This is better, actually. I get to kill everyone who knows the truth about Red Hook. Very efficient." Vincent looked at Tiana and saw his own death reflected in her eyes. And he looked at Sophia, who was crying silently, and he thought about his life, about all the violence and the power and the fear he'd commanded, and none of it mattered now. None of it could save the 2 women he loved, and he felt the full weight of his failures crushing down on him like a physical thing. And for the first time in his adult life, Vincent Valiant had no play, no move, no way out. And the despair was so complete, it took his breath away. "Any last words?" Carmine asked, and he was enjoying this, was savoring Vincent's destruction, and Vincent thought about begging, but knew it would do no good. Thought about fighting, but knew he'd die before he took 2 steps. And then Tiana's hand found his and squeezed. And when he looked at her, she mouthed, "I love you." And Vincent squeezed back and said out loud so everyone could hear, "I love you too, and I'm sorry I couldn't give you the life you deserved." And Carmine made a gagging sound and said, "How touching. The killer found love. Someone call Hallmark." And he raised his gun and pointed it at Vincent's head. And Vincent closed his eyes and thought at least it would be quick. At least he'd die with Tiana's hand in his. At least he wouldn't die alone like he'd always feared. And he heard the gun cock and heard Carmine say, "Goodbye, Vinny." And Vincent waited for the bullet that would end everything. And in that moment, he prayed to a God he'd stopped believing in decades ago, that somehow Tiana and Sophia would survive this, that his death would be enough to satisfy Carmine's revenge. And the prayer felt useless, but it was all he had left. The gunshot exploded through the warehouse, but Vincent didn't feel the impact, didn't feel anything except Tiana's hand jerking in his, and his eyes snapped open to see Carmine stumbling backward, his gun falling from his hand. a red stain spreading across his shoulder, and Vincent's brain couldn't process what was happening until he heard a voice from the catwalk above shout, "FBI! Everyone on the ground now!" And suddenly the warehouse was flooding with federal agents in tactical gear, and Carmine's men were dropping their weapons. And Vincent turned to see Agent Sarah Dawson, a woman he'd dealt with years ago during a racketeering investigation, leading a team down the stairs. And behind her was Anthony, his brother, looking terrified and relieved and guilty all at once. "I'm sorry." "Vinny!" Anthony called out as agents swarmed the room. "I had to make him think I betrayed you. Had to get him confident enough to confess. I've been wearing a wire for the FBI for 3 months, ever since I started suspecting Carmine was stealing from the family. And tonight he admitted everything. The frame job, the Red Hook setup, all of it. We got it all on tape." And Vincent's legs nearly gave out, because his brother hadn't betrayed him, had been working to save him, and the relief was so intense it felt like drowning in reverse, like servicing after being underwater for too long. Vincent ran to Sophia and cut her restraints with a knife one of the agents handed him, and she collapsed into his arms sobbing, and he held her like he'd wanted to hold her for 3 years. And she whispered, "I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm sorry I cut you off. I was so angry, but I never stopped loving you." And Vincent's tears came then, hot and unstoppable. And he said, "I'm the one who's sorry, baby girl. I'm sorry for every moment I chose this life over you. I'm sorry for everything." And they clung to each other while chaos erupted around them. Agents arresting Carmine's men, reading rights. And Vincent looked over Sophia's shoulder to see Tiana being helped up by a female agent. And their eyes met across the warehouse. And the love in her gaze was so pure, it hurt to look at directly. Agent Dawson approached Vincent with a tablet and said, "Your brother brought us enough evidence to bury Carmine for the rest of his life. The wire recording from tonight is just a crown jewel. We've got the financial records showing he's been embezzling from your organization for 6 years. We've got testimony from witnesses he tried to silence. And we've got documentation of the Red Hook operation that killed Jerome Bogart." And she looked at Tiana when she said the name, and Tiana's whole body went rigid. And Dawson continued, "We know you've been investigating your brother's death, Ms. Bogart. And I want you to know that the officers involved in that shooting are being brought up on charges. Our investigation found they were paid by Carmine to raid that warehouse and eliminate your brother who'd witnessed a murder Carmine committed during a deal gone bad. Your brother was a good man in the wrong place, and we're going to make sure everyone knows that." Tiana's knees buckled, and Vincent gently released Sophia and caught Tiana, and she buried her face in his chest and sobbed 5 years of grief and rage and injustice. And Vincent held her and stroked her hair and whispered, "Justice, baby. He's getting justice. Your brother's getting justice." And he'd never felt more grateful for anything than the fact that this woman's pain might finally have an end. Are you crying right now? Because I'm telling you, this redemption is hitting different. Let me know in the comments if you believe in second chances. Anthony walked over slowly, his hands shaking, and he looked at Vincent and said, "I couldn't tell you what I was doing. The FBI said if anyone knew I was cooperating, it could blow the whole investigation. And when Carmine threatened my kids, I had to play along, had to make him think I was scared enough to betray you. And tonight, when you called about the evidence, I fed him exactly what Agent Dawson told me to. Made him overconfident, made him bring everyone together so we could take down the whole operation at once." And Vincent released Tiana long enough to pull his brother into a hard embrace. And Anthony said, "I never doubted you, Vinny. Not for a second. I know you, and I knew Carmine was lying. I just needed proof." And Vincent said, "You saved my life, Tony. You saved all of us." Sophia approached Tiana tentatively and said, "You're the woman my dad's been talking about." And Tiana wiped her eyes and smiled and said, "I hope he said good things." And Sophia laughed and said, "He said you were brave and beautiful, and you made him want to be better. And I've never heard my dad talk about anyone like that, not even my mom." And Tiana looked at Vincent with such tenderness it made his chest tight. And Sophia continued, "Thank you for protecting him, for helping him when everyone else turned away. My dad's made mistakes, but he's not the monster people think he is. And I'm glad he had you." And Tiana took Sophia's hand and said, "Your dad's a good man who got trapped in a bad life. But that's over now. Everything's different now." Agent Dawson called Vincent over and said, "We're arresting Carmine and his top lieutenants, and we're dismantling the organization. But Vincent, you're not walking away clean either. You've committed crimes, you've hurt people, and there are consequences." And Vincent nodded, because he'd expected this. Had known that, even if he cleared his name with the family, he'd still have to answer to the law. And Dawson said, "But you've also been cooperative in past investigations. You've never killed anyone personally, according to our files. And your brother vouches that you've been trying to go legitimate for the past 2 years. So here's the deal. You testify against Carmine and everyone in that organization. You give us everything you know, and we'll recommend minimum security, probably 18 months, maybe less with good behavior. And when you get out, you're done. You're out of the life forever. You take your daughter and your girlfriend, and you disappear into civilian life, and we never see you again." Vincent looked at Sophia, who nodded encouragingly, looked at Tiana, who squeezed his hand, and he looked back at Dawson and said, "I'll take it. I'll testify to everything. I'll burn it all down if it means I get a chance at a real life when I come out." And Dawson smiled and said, "Smart choice. We'll process you tomorrow. Tonight you get to go home with your family. Consider it professional courtesy for your brother's cooperation." And she walked away, leaving Vincent standing with the 3 people who mattered most. His brother who'd saved him, his daughter who'd forgiven him, and the woman who'd shown him that love was stronger than fear. Carmine was being led past them in handcuffs, and he spat at Vincent's feet and said, "You're dead, Vinny. You think witness protection can save you. You think you can testify and live. I've got people everywhere." But Vincent just looked at him with pity instead of fear and said, "You've got nothing, Carmine. You're finished, and I'm free. Maybe not today, maybe not for 18 months, but I'm free of you in this life and the hate that's been eating me alive for decades. So threaten all you want. I'm not afraid anymore." And he turned his back on Carmine and walked toward the door with Sophia on one side and Tiana on the other, and Anthony followed behind. And for the first time in his adult life, Vincent Valiant walked away from violence instead of toward it, and the feeling was better than any power he'd ever held. Part 8. Climactic Resolution. 3 months later, Vincent was in a safe house in upstate New York, preparing for his testimony in Carmine's trial, and Tiana had been staying with him along with Sophia, because Agent Dawson had approved family visits, and life had taken on a strange normalcy that Vincent had never experienced, cooking breakfast together, watching movies at night, talking about futures that actually seemed possible. But on the morning of his scheduled testimony, Vincent's phone rang with a number that made his blood run cold because it was from inside the federal courthouse. And when he answered, a distorted voice said, "Your daughter's in the gallery, 2nd row, pretty blue dress. Would be a shame if something happened during all the chaos of a trial. Carmine sends his regards." And the line went dead, and Vincent realized that Carmine had managed to get a message out, had arranged one final play, and Sophia was walking into a trap. Vincent grabbed his FBI handler and explained the threat, and Agent Dawson immediately locked down the courthouse and started evacuating. But Vincent knew Carmine's people, knew they'd have a backup plan, knew they'd have anticipated federal response. And his mind raced through scenarios until he realized the only way to end this permanently was to face Carmine directly, to get him to confess on record that he was still ordering hits from jail, still threatening witnesses, which would add decades to his sentence and eliminate any chance of him making deals or getting parole. "Let me see him," Vincent said to Dawson, and she looked at him like he was crazy. But Vincent explained his plan. "Wire me up. Let me go into the holding cell. Let me make him so angry he admits to everything. The Red Hook killing, Jerome Bogart, the threats against Sophia, all of it. You get it on tape, and you've got him forever. No deals, no appeals. Just life in a supermax where he can't hurt anyone ever again." Dawson considered it for 30 seconds and said, "You're not an agent. You're a witness. I can't authorize civilians for undercover operations." But Anthony, who'd been in the safe house helping Vincent prepare, stepped forward and said, "Then wire me. I'm his brother. Carmine will talk to me. Will probably brag to me thinking I'm still scared." And Vincent started to protest, but Anthony cut him off. "You've been protecting everyone else this whole time, Vinny. Let me protect you for once. Let me finish what I started." And the determination in his brother's eyes reminded Vincent of their father. And he nodded, because Anthony was right. This was their family's mess to clean up, their chance to end the cycle of violence that had consumed 3 generations. The FBI set up Anthony with a wire so sophisticated it was invisible, and they coached him on what to say, what buttons to push. And Vincent watched on a monitor from a van outside the courthouse, as his brother was led into the holding cell, where Carmine sat in an orange jumpsuit. And Carmine's face lit up when he saw Anthony, and he said, "Tony, my man, you here to get me out of this mess? You know I'm good for whatever you need. Just talk to the feds. Tell them you made a mistake with that testimony." And Anthony sat down across from him and said, "I can't do that. Carmine, you threatened my kids. You tried to kill my brother. You framed him for crimes you committed. Why would I help you?" Carmine's expression shifted from friendly to dangerous in half a second, and he leaned forward and said, "Because if you don't, that crew I've got in the courthouse right now is going to do something very loud and very messy, and your niece Sophia is going to be collateral damage. And then we're going to come for your kids and your wife and everyone you've ever cared about. And yeah, I'll die in prison, but you'll die knowing you could have stopped it." And Vincent watched the monitor with his hands clenched, because Carmine had just admitted to an active threat, had just confessed to conspiracy to commit murder. And Agent Dawson smiled grimly and said, "Got him." But Anthony wasn't done. Anthony leaned back and said, "You're bluffing. You've got nothing. You're in jail. Your organization is dismantled. Your money's frozen. Who's going to carry out these threats?" And Carmine laughed and said, "You think this is my first time in lockup? I've got contacts everywhere. Got a crew in this courthouse right now. Got the guard 3 cells down on my payroll. Got a judge who owes me favors. And yeah, I'm going down. But I'm taking everyone who betrayed me down too. Starting with that black waitress who stuck her nose where it didn't belong. The one who killed her brother Jerome. Oh wait, that was me. Popped him myself when he saw me execute that dealer from the Bronx. And then I called his sister's name into the cops and made it look like a drug raid." Vincent's vision went red, because Carmine had just confessed to murdering Jerome personally, had just given them everything they needed. And Tiana, who was in the van listening, grabbed Vincent's arm so hard her nails drew blood, and tears streamed down her face. But she was smiling, was finally hearing the truth after 5 years of questions. And Vincent pulled her close and whispered, "Justice, baby. He just gave us justice." And she nodded against his chest and said, "My brother can finally rest now. I can finally rest now." Anthony stood up in the holding cell and said, "You're a monster, Carmine. You always were. And I'm glad my brother is nothing like you. I'm glad he's getting out of this life. And I'm glad I get to watch you rot." And Carmine lunged at him, but the guards were already moving, were already restraining him. And Anthony walked out of that cell with his head high. And when he emerged into the hallway, Vincent was waiting. And they embraced like they used to when they were kids before the family business had complicated everything. And Anthony said, "We're free, Vinny. We're finally free of him." Agent Dawson arrested 3 people in the courthouse that day based on Carmine's confession, including a bailiff, a security guard, and a court stenographer who'd all been on his payroll. And they found weapons hidden in 2 different locations. And Dawson told Vincent, "You were right. He had a whole operation planned. If we hadn't gotten that confession, if we hadn't moved when we did, people would have died." And Vincent thought about how close they'd come to losing everything. How one phone call had nearly destroyed the fragile peace they'd built. But they'd survived. They'd won. And Carmine was going away forever. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and Vincent testified for 3 days straight, telling everything he knew about the organization, about Carmine's operations, about corruption and violence and the machinery of crime that had run New York's underworld for decades. And every day Tiana sat in the gallery, in a different dress, just to show Carmine she wasn't afraid. And Sophia sat next to her. And Anthony sat on Tiana's other side. And they were a family, this strange, beautiful family built from tragedy and redemption. And Vincent looked at them whenever the testimony got hard, whenever the defense attorneys tried to break him down, and their faces gave him strength. Make sure you're subscribed, because the ending of this story is going to restore your faith in love and second chances, and I want you here for it. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on all 47 counts, including first-degree murder for Jerome Bogart's death. And when the forewoman read the verdict, Carmine's face went blank with shock, because he truly believed until that moment that he'd escape, that his lawyers would find a loophole, that his connections would save him. But justice was blind to everything except evidence and truth, and the evidence buried him 6 feet deep. The judge sentenced Carmine to life without parole, plus 300 years to be served in ADX Florence, the supermax prison where the worst of the worst disappeared forever. And as they led him out of the courtroom, he looked at Vincent one last time, and Vincent saw not a monster, but a pathetic old man who'd chosen power over humanity and lost everything that mattered. And Vincent felt not triumph, but pity, because that could have been him. That would have been him if Tiana hadn't shown him a different way. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, but Vincent walked past them with his head down, holding Tiana's hand on one side and Sophia's on the other, and they climbed into a car that took them away from that world forever. And in the back seat, Sophia said, "What happens now, Dad?" And Vincent looked at Tiana, who smiled and said, "Now we live, sweetheart. We just live." And Vincent kissed her, because she was right. They'd earned the right to simple, ordinary happiness. And he was going to spend every remaining day of his life making sure the women he loved never regretted giving him a second chance. Vincent's own sentencing came 2 weeks later, and the judge, after hearing testimony about his cooperation, about the lives saved by his evidence, about his genuine remorse and commitment to change, sentenced him to 12 months in minimum security with credit for time served during the trial, which meant he'd be out in 8 months. And when the gavel fell, Tiana blew him a kiss from the gallery, and Vincent caught it and pressed his fist to his heart. And even though he was going to prison, He felt freer than he'd ever felt in his life, because the cage he was entering had an exit date. But the cage he'd been living in before Tiana had been permanent, had been slowly killing him. And now he had hope, had love, had a future worth surviving for. 8 months later, Vincent walked out of the Federal Correctional Institution in Otisville into October sunshine that felt like heaven on his skin. And the first thing he saw was Tiana, standing by a car with Kennedy beside her and Sophia next to them, and Anthony leaning against the hood. And his whole family was there to bring him home. And the sight made his throat close up with emotion, because he'd spent 8 months imagining this moment. But reality was so much better than any dream. Tiana ran to him first and jumped into his arms, and he caught her and spun her around. And she kissed him like she was trying to make up for every day they'd been apart. And when they finally broke apart, she whispered, "Welcome home, baby." And Vincent said, "Home is wherever you are." And it was the truest thing he'd ever said, because Tiana had become his North Star, his reason for staying strong through the hardest months of his life. Kennedy approached shyly because she'd only met Vincent twice before he went in, and he crouched down to her level and said, "Hi, Kennedy. Your mom's told me so much about you in her letters." And Kennedy looked at her mom and then back at Vincent and said, Are you going to be my dad now?" And the question hung in the air, sweet and terrifying. And Vincent looked at Tiana, who had tears in her eyes. And he said, "I'd like to be, if that's okay with you." And Kennedy threw her arms around his neck and said, "Okay, but you have to learn to braid hair, because Mom's terrible at it." And everyone laughed, and Vincent felt his heart expand to make room for this beautiful child who was willing to accept him into her life. Sophia hugged him next, and she felt taller, felt more grown up than when he'd gone in. And she said, "I'm proud of you, Dad. You did the hard thing. You chose to be better." And Vincent said, "I learned from the best." And Sophia smiled and said, "I'm moving back to New York. Got a job at a nonprofit helping families affected by incarceration. And I want you in my life, really in it this time. Sunday dinners and birthday calls and all the normal stuff we never did." And Vincent nodded, because his voice wouldn't work. Because the forgiveness his daughter was offering felt like grace he didn't deserve but would spend his life earning. Anthony drove them to a small house in Westchester that Vincent had never seen before. And when they pulled up, Tiana said, "Surprise. I used some of the money from the victim's compensation fund the state gave me for Jerome's wrongful death. And I bought us a house. Nothing fancy, but it's got 4 bedrooms and a yard. And it's far enough from the city that nobody knows your name." And Vincent looked at this house, with its blue shutters and neat garden, and realized Tiana had built them a future while he was locked up, had created a home for their blended family. And he said, "It's perfect. You're perfect. How did I get so lucky?" And Tiana laughed and said, "Lucky? Baby, you got shot, framed, almost killed, and spent 8 months in prison. That's not lucky." And Vincent pulled her close and said, "But it brought me to you. So yeah, I'm the luckiest man alive." Inside the house, there was a banner that said, "Welcome home," and a cake that Kennedy had clearly helped decorate because it was covered in sprinkles and said "Dad" in wobbly letters. And Vincent's eyes filled with tears for the 100th time that day. And Tiana teased him gently, saying, "Big tough mafia boss crying over cake." And Vincent said, "Former mafia boss. I'm just a regular guy now. A regular guy who cries at cake, apparently." And everyone laughed, and it was the best sound Vincent had ever heard, better than any power or respect he'd commanded in his old life. If this story touched your heart, do me a favor and share it with someone who needs to believe in redemption. And leave a comment telling me what second chances mean to you. They ate cake and talked about the future, and Anthony announced he was opening a restaurant with money he'd saved from his years in the organization, going legitimate just like Vincent. And Sophia talked about her new job and her new apartment. And Kennedy showed Vincent her room that Tiana had decorated with stars on the ceiling, and Vincent felt like he'd stepped into someone else's life. Some normal, beautiful life he'd never thought possible for someone like him. That night, after Kennedy and Sophia had gone to bed, and Anthony had driven home to his own family, Vincent and Tiana sat on the back porch under those same stars, and Vincent pulled out a small box he'd been carrying in his pocket since his release. And he said, "I bought this with money I made in prison working in the library, 67 cents an hour for 8 months. And it's not much, but it's honest money, the first honest money I've made in my entire adult life." And he opened the box to reveal a simple silver ring with a small diamond. And Tiana gasped and covered her mouth. And Vincent said, "Tiana Bogart, you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You gave me a reason to be better. You showed me what real strength looks like. And you loved me when I was unlovable. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you see when you look at me?" Tiana was crying and laughing at the same time, and she said, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." And Vincent slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly. And they kissed under the stars like teenagers, like people who had all the time in the world, like people who'd survived hell and come out believing in heaven. "I love you," Vincent said. And Tiana said, "I love you too. And I'm so glad you walked into my diner that night." And Vincent laughed and said, "You mean the night I was bleeding and running for my life?" And Tiana smiled and said, "Yeah, that night. The night everything changed. The night the big bad Mafia boss met a waitress who wasn't afraid of him." And Vincent corrected her gently. "The night a broken man met a woman who showed him how to heal." 6 months later, they got married in the backyard of their Westchester house with Kennedy as the flower girl, and Sophia as Tiana's maid of honor, and Anthony as Vincent's best man. And it was small and simple and perfect. And when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Vincent kissed his bride and thought about the journey that had brought them here, about a robbery that became a rescue, about fear that became love, about a life of violence that became a life of peace. And he sent up a silent thank you to whatever force had guided him into the diner on the worst and best night of his life. Vincent got a job as a consultant helping businesses with security, using his knowledge of how criminals think to protect people instead of hurt them. And Tiana kept working at a different diner closer to home because she said she liked the work, liked the people, liked staying grounded in the real world. And together they raised Kennedy and stayed close to Sophia and had Sunday dinners with Anthony's family. And they were happy. Genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with power or money or respect, and everything to do with love and second chances, and choosing every single day to be better than yesterday. On the 1-year anniversary of the night they met, Vincent and Tiana went back to Rosie's diner, and the owner recognized them and gave them free coffee, and they sat in the same booth where Vincent had been sitting when the robbers came in. And Tiana said, "If you could go back and change anything about that night, would you?" And Vincent thought about it and said, "Not a single thing, because every moment, good and bad, led me to you, led me to this life, led me to being a man my daughter is proud of, and a husband worthy of you, and a father to Kennedy, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." They raised their coffee cups in a toast to second chances, to courage, to love that blooms in impossible places, and to the truth that sometimes the darkest nights lead to the brightest mornings. And as they sat there in that booth where everything had changed, Vincent Valiant, former Mafia boss, current husband and father and honest man, smiled at his wife, and knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And for the first time in his life, he was home.